Hello everyone, and warm welcome to the webinar on best practices for software development in GÉANT. The webinar will be delivered by a team of presenters, all members of WP9 Task 2, the team that put a lot of time and effort in putting together and launching first ever GÉANT software catalog last year and extending their work to the best practice for software development. As you can see from the agenda, we're aiming to cover quite a number of subjects. And for this reason, without further ado, let me hand over to Branko, our first presenter for today. And Branko will start with introducing the team and outlining the range of services that the team is offering to software development. Enjoy the webinar.
The model development. I will first give you a couple of introductory slides that will give you some ideas about the overall context. Our aim is to assist software development teams in governance of their projects. And our assistance and support should be is based on the outcomes of the previous GÉANT phases, on the experience that many of us had while working within GÉANT, but also we should bring in the expertise that we provide from our other activities. WP9 Task 2 also delivers a wider range of services to development teams, such as code reviews, trainings, and tools. In this phase, we are focusing on best practices in software development. I will briefly describe you what has already taken place on this subject, how we plan to continue with it, and how everyone may benefit from both adopting and contributing to common best practices. The software management team standing behind this effort includes Adriana, Bartek, me, Ivan, and Marcin. How this started? Near the end of the previous GÉANT phase and the first half of 2019, we outlined a software maturity model as a framework for capturing and structuring the knowledge and the overall processes. During past summer, we conducted a series. We prepared a questionnaire, which we used to interview 12 software development teams. Some of you who are present here today also participated in some of those interviews, and these dialogues gave us quite extensive inputs of both your practices, your scale of your projects, and your needs and shortcomings. Of course, the idea wasn't to rank or do anything of that kind, but to facilitate improvement. And we also consulted a wider architecture in the field, and from all those inputs, we outlined the set of common best practices. Now you will learn about the catalog and about a couple of examples that will be described by other presenters. And what we aim to is to working together with you to tailor, adopt, and refine those practices in all areas that seek improvement. Just one word about GÉANT's software maturity model. It aims to apply the knowledge in software development, operations, and improvement process, and also to facilitate adoption of industry-wide practices. We, at the same time, in the context slightly wider than the one of the best practices, we want to capture practices that help teams and to identify areas for further improvement that's quite important, could be applied across teams, because then we get a synergy and get consolidation of the way things are being done. It is being done through capturing of relevant aspects of software engineering, through help provided to the teams in reflecting on their practices. The interviews are one example of this help. Another, because we heard the comments that some people, that this exercise helped actually very teams to think and reconsider what they do and how they do it. And this will be continued with other alternatives. We also and which will also facilitate dialogue and self-improvement. We, as mentioned, have identified some needs and common practices, and we are going to assist teams in improving and enhancing the quality of their work, as it will be illustrated through the examples that will be provided today. There is an alignment between the maturity model and common best practices because they share the same 5 target areas or areas of best practices, which include requirements management, software design and implementation, quality assurance, team organization, and maintenance. Each one of these areas is being covered by several specific goals and practices that may mutually overlap, meaning that one practice may address several specific goals, or that some specific goals could be mutually and complementarily addressed by several practices. What we plan to do next? We will conduct a series of simple and low effort online surveys, in contrast with the previous interviews, in order to collect feedback from software teams and to iteratively establish and capture indicators related both to the best practices and the maturity model. We invite all software teams to participate in those online surveys, and we want to conduct them periodically, on average every 4 to 6 months. While the interviews took up to 2 hours to conduct, these surveys should be much simpler and much easier. And although the questions or the content of those surveys will change in time, they will all share the common general structures, where you will have opportunity to note issues with specific best practices and wider improvement areas. You may express interest in other topics. You will provide some simple options-based answers in order to extract a few simple metrics, and both your ideas, complaints, or suggestions for extension of some topics or some detailed feedback is to be provided through open questions. Now I would like to ask Bartek to continue with his part of the presentation and provide more details on best practices. So the button is on you now.
Okay, so thank you very much, Branko. I am Bartek Walter. I work for PSNC, and recently I focused on the best practices. And I would like to tell you a few words, just the catalog we have created. But the first question we need to answer is what actually is a best practice? So to our understanding, the best practice is an agreed and effective method of achieving some objective. Of course, we need to consider the context in which the best practice has been captured, and the best practice is required to include a number of recommendations, and either actionable or directional. I would like here to outline that the best practices are not just procedures to be implemented. They are just advices of what worked well in other teams and how other teams, new teams, can just adopt those best practices and put them into their everyday life. So actually the best practices extract the existing experience and transform it into knowledge. So they make something like a more learning organization from GÉANT. And additionally, they allow the teams not just to share their own experiences, but also to benefit from the experience of other teams. So it's our joint efforts to create and refine them. If we take a closer look on the sources of information that helped us to define and extract those best practices, we can see three main sources. First, of course, these are the current practices used in teams. So each interview we made with the teams just provided a number of hints of what worked well and what they advise other teams to follow. The other source is the literature review. So we also looked for some indications in the existing literature, existing papers of what is recommended practice currently in software engineering. And the third source is the observation, either made by us or other stakeholders. And all those three sources together just made a foundation for the common best practices for software development. Best practice should be described in a manner that would be easy to understand for the recipients. So we decided to follow the advice provided by the Gang of Four, the authors of design patterns, and we provided something like a template for describing the best practices. So actually we identified a number of attributes that describe each practice. Here I put a number of such attributes we extracted and highlighted those I find particularly relevant. So for example, each practice is described by its objective, so what the given practice wants to achieve. Then we describe the context, which is a set of circumstances and settings, constraints, in which the practice has been found to work particularly well. Then, of course, the major point, which is the recommendation. The recommendation provides a directional advice of what to do in order to implement this practice. I would like here to outline, we don't provide the direct advice. It's the job of the teams to just adapt to their own context. But still, the recommendation just turns the attention of the teams to some important issues that should be addressed. And of course, the final major element of each best practice is the list of risks. Well, a best practice is a recommendation, but implementation of such a recommendation may result in some undesired results. So in the risk attribute, we enumerate those possible consequences of the practice misuse, and the teams should also be aware of that. Now I would like to present two practices we extracted, and they will be later supplemented by some examples, practical examples provided by the teams who already adopted those practices. So the first practice will concern a requirements target area, and specifically it will be concerned about identification, analysis, and management of requirements. So let's take a closer look at it. The objective for it is, of course, to extract and manage the requirements based on some informal needs and remarks made by the stakeholders. So what we need to do is to transform or extract the relevant information from those needs, from those remarks, and make them into requirements. So first, the 4 major recommendations. First is quite general, and it concerns formulating the requirements based on the needs expressed by the stakeholders. It's quite important not just to create new requirements without the support from the stakeholders. Later, we outline the importance of maintaining the traceability links between the requirements and the needs, so that we still can tell which stakeholders, so who specifically mentioned this specific need. Then we advertise some tools, and we advise you to use the tools to support the management. And Maciej, in a few minutes, will tell a little bit about such an example. And of course, we also recommend validating the requirements with the stakeholders so that they can confirm that those requirements are just reflecting their actual needs. We identified 2 major risk factors. First, the resulting requirements may be not verifiable. We remember that requirements create a basis for defining test cases. So if we do not formulate the requirements in a verifiable way, then the test cases may be affected as well. And the second risk refers to traceability issue. If the requirements cannot be traced back to the needs of stakeholders, then probably we will not be able to properly prioritize them. Okay, so now let's pass to the second practice I would like to talk today. It is about the design and implementation target area. And specifically, it refers to verification of the subject licenses of the third-party libraries and checking whether they conform to the constraints imposed by the organization and whether they are mutually compatible. So the objective is first to check whether the libraries are compatible and whether they're in line with the organization's policy. We have 3 major recommendations. First, we need to verify if the subject licenses conform to the constraints imposed by the organization, so by GÉANT in our case. Secondly, we want to make a closer look into the intrinsic dependencies of licenses and check whether they comply to each other. So whether they do not make some confrontation against each other. And third recommendation applies to documenting the libraries and the licenses so that we can track the changes in the used libraries. We see 2 major risk factors. First, it follows from the possible misinterpretation of the license rights and entitlements. So they should be clear and they should be explicitly explained. And the second risk factor is about incompatibility of the licenses. So as if we want to take a closer look in our setting, we can see that from the software maturity model we have been working for several months before, we have created a catalog of best practices. The catalog, as Branko indicated, consists of target areas, which comprises best practices focused on a specific activity in a software team. We extracted 5 such target areas, and recently I talked about requirements and the design and implementation target areas. Now, I would like to ask Maciej and Alan, who will present examples of implementation of those 2 practices I was talking about. So Maciej, please take the role of the leader and show us how you made it to identify, analyze, and manage requirements in your team?
Thank you, Bartosz, for this introduction. My name is Maciej Łabęcki. I work in PSNC, and in GÉANT, I am leading a team that develops and operates the software catalog service. During this webinar, I'm going to reference the identification of software requirements best practice. Now I'm switching to screen sharing. This may take a few seconds. Could you please confirm that you can see the sticky notes?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, great. I'm presenting a software project named Software Catalog, where no one came with already defined requirements, and the initiative emerged in a small team. Because of the above, there was a need for discovery of stakeholders and functional requirements. Moreover, there was a difficulty that the team and stakeholders were and still are distributed. Now I'm going to enumerate and briefly explain how we implemented requirements analysis and management. First of all, let me mention the tools. What you can see on the screen is Miro. Miro is a web browser-based tool, a kind of a virtual wallboard for free arrangement of sticky notes, graphics, URLs, etc. It's very intuitive. Miro helped us with real-time collaboration during brainstorming by giving us ability to rapidly visualize ideas. Therefore, it helped in implementing other practices. GÉANT Wiki. Known very well by GÉANT participants, it helped us in documenting official requirements in a structured way and in creation of summary pages with use of function called page properties. Strategic assumptions. At the very beginning, we formulated so-called strategic assumptions in the form you can see on the screenshot. It helped us in making decisions in later phases of requirements analysis. This is because we formulated very, very basic requirements by defining main goals, the way we want to achieve them, and things we should avoid. Personas. Personas, as well as other techniques I'm going to talk about, are the industry common best practices widely described in the literature and in internet. We used personas to discover and characterize stakeholders. This was a mandatory step in our case as we were the inventors of the project. Personas helped us in coming closer to real users, better understanding their perception of created software, and avoiding being locked in developers' perception. Value proposition canvas. This kind of a graphical template or layout was used to identify very specific needs of stakeholders by discovery of stakeholders' daily tasks and problems. It helped us in extending the knowledge extracted from personas and in mapping small problems of users to small solutions in software catalog application. User story mapping. This technique helped us in structuring the collected feedback, defining business processes, mapping the business processes into implementable features, building an overview, a big picture of the whole system, and giving a direct input for programmers during development of a first working version. User journeys is another useful technique which helped us in identification of most critical usage scenarios, definition of core acceptance criteria, and providing input for the testing teams. Detailed requirements specification on the wiki helped us in documenting official feature requests, getting agreements on those requests between the team and stakeholders, and giving a direct input for programmers when extending an already mature product, not a first release. We achieved that thanks to exhaustive and detailed descriptions of specific demands and providing examples of expected results. And the last one, event storming. It's a relatively new technique, and as a team, we are still learning it. Event storming helps in understanding the mechanics of complex business domain and identification of important events, actors, rules, restrictions, and key entities with their properties. When used together with domain-driven design, it allows the team to finally reach a well-technical software design. Event storming is a subject to upcoming training events, School of Software Engineering, which will take place in autumn 2020. The SSE is an annual event since 2010. I honestly invite you to track news about that event through the GÉANT communication channels. Thank you. This part was related to requirements analysis best practice in software project named Software Catalog. Now let me pass voice to Alan.
Thanks, Maciej. And hello, everybody. Let me just share my screen first of all. If you could stop sharing, great.
Yep.
Okay. Hopefully you can all see that. Well, let me introduce myself first of all. For those of you who don't know me, I am Alan Lewis. I'm a product manager at GÉANT in Cambridge. And what I'd like to do is expand on one of the best practices that Bartok has mentioned, namely verifying the licenses of libraries that are being used in the project. And I'd like to tell you something of how what we're doing with software composition analysis can help with not only this, but also with identifying software security vulnerabilities. So let's make a start. So projects are becoming more and more complex. And as a result, they're using more and more third-party software, so they don't have to start inventing things from scratch. And so they can complete the work they need to do as quickly as possible. However, we need to be careful because using this third-party software may bring with it some risk. For example, licenses can contain terms or obligations which may require us to do things that we don't want to do. For example, perhaps pay royalties to third parties. And this obviously can have a large strategic impact on the plans we might have for our projects. Also, software libraries might contain security vulnerabilities, which if exploited, could have a direct effect on the reputation of GÉANT or the trust of the community in the services that we're trying to provide. Finally, we might unknowingly be using IP without the necessary rights, and this can have severe financial consequences for GÉANT and possibly even for the individuals concerned in development. So we need to think very carefully about these things before we release software into the wide world. So the question is, what can we do about it? Are there any tools that can help us in this area? Well, software composition analysis tools can help in identifying these risks and to some extent in helping to propose solutions as well. So what do the tools do? To describe this, I'll focus on the tool from WhiteSource that we selected to be the basis of a new service that we're now offering. Essentially, what it does is it parses the software repositories and identifies dependent libraries. Once they've been identified, it can look up information relating to known security vulnerabilities and all the licensing terms, and then it can highlight any issues. So then these issues that have been highlighted can be notified by a group of people, obviously to the project team, but also to the IPR coordinator and to any security experts, so they can investigate them and they can help the team get them fixed if that turns out to be necessary. So that's very clever. So how does it do this? Well, it's relatively simple. An agent, a Java application, is downloaded locally and it scans the project structure. It generates a hash of the file and it uses this hash to identify the library and set of databases that WhiteSource maintain. So actually no code actually leaves the premises. There's no direct code comparison. The comparison is just done between the hash and hashes in a database. And based on this information, it can then identify the associated libraries and licenses through its own and various third-party databases, and also identify the vulnerabilities through databases that it creates itself and through things like the National Vulnerability Database. Once it's done that, the information can be presented in a set of reports, or as shown here, in a dashboard, and then that can be investigated in more detail to find out what the issues are. So let's take a bit of a closer look at what WhiteSource provides on its dashboard. So this is the main dashboard that you see when you enter the WhiteSource product. And you can see it's got some graphics and it's got a number of different sections. I'll just step through a few of the main features so you can get a feeling for some of the things that it covers. So towards the left here, you can see a box called policy. So policies allow us to set up a set of logical rules that are checked during the scan. The rules describe which licenses we allow and which license we don't allow. They also describe what level of security risk is acceptable based on a security risk score. And we can set various other attributes as well. I mean, you can see for WiFiMon, which this scan is based on, that there were no policy violations. If there had been, we'd have been able to drill down in more detail and find out exactly what they are. Now, these violations can trigger various events. For example, informing people that they need to take specific actions, perhaps by raising a JIRA ticket, so they have to deal with that. Another thing they can do is they can actually break a build, so they can inform the developers that a problem has occurred and they can stop the build from progressing, allowing them to investigate it. So next to this, you can see an area called libraries. Now this tells us how many libraries we're using that have a newer version available, and how many libraries might have multiple versions of licenses associated with them. It also tells us if different versions of licenses are being used in different parts of the project. Moving again over here to the right, there's an area called security. And now this shows us how many vulnerabilities at various levels of severity we have and how these are distributed throughout the libraries. And this is also shown again in this nice little donut diagram here on the right. If I drop down below this, you can see a license analysis. So this shows us how many different licenses are used in all the libraries throughout the project and how protective or permissive those licenses are. So for example, going from the red where we have strongly protective licenses through the amber all the way to the green where the licenses are very permissive, which would allow software to become proprietary if we wanted that to happen. Finally, you can see there's a menu bar at the top, which has got a range of options that allows us to configure the view and generate one or more different types of report for different products or projects being subsets of products. And there's a whole set of different reports that can be generated. It's a very flexible tool. So that's all very good. It's a very useful tool. So how does it get accessed? Well, we've got a new service. It's a complementary service to the other software projects on our own code. This looks instead at third-party code we're using and uses this new WhiteSource tool that I've just described. So this is a new offering. It's supported by WP9 Task 2, and it's available in a similar request-based fashion to the other checks that they currently support. So currently what we have available now is an on-demand service that can be triggered as required when you need it. For example, when a release is due or where a gate review requires evidence of IPR or security checking. The process is very straightforward, and I'll say a bit more about the steps involved when I talk about this in the next slide in reference to WiFiMon as an example. In the future, what we hope to do is we plan to enable work packages to integrate the use of the WhiteSource tool into their own development tool chains so that the issues can be identified early on in the early phases of the project. This makes changes much easier and it is far less costly to the project overall. You can see the details about how this service is accessed and what capabilities it has by following this link, which you'll get at the slides at the end of this presentation today. And also this is referenced again in the links at the end of the whole presentation that Bartek will put up at the end. So let's have a look at WiFiMon in a bit more detail and see how this process actually worked in practice. So WiFiMon was first scanned on around the 14th of April this year. Process worked very smoothly as far as the feedback I have from the team, and it consists of 4 main steps. So there's a scanning step where a request is put in. There's an exchange of information. There's the actual scanning by the WhiteSource tool itself, and then there's feedback of the information. So how do these steps work? So the scanning step is initiated normally by the product manager or the task leader, who requests access to the necessary repository where the code is stored. In this exchange step, in this case, the Bitbucket link was provided to the test team, and then a kickoff meeting was held to get the details to set up this WhiteSource Java scanning agent. And all the further communication was carried as normal with Work Package 9 Task 2 over a Slack channel. During the scanning step, WhiteSource looks at the project, it scans it, and based on the information, it creates a risk report. Finally, in the feedback step, this risk report and a recommendation from the tool, together with further information and recommendations from the IPR and the security experts, given back to the team. Also, links provided to the WhiteSource dashboard so that if there are issues, they can be examined in more detail, and with the help of the security and IPR experts, any issues can be resolved. So what can we tell from looking at the scanning information? So firstly, if you have a look on the left here, you can see that 6 libraries had vulnerabilities, and they've been identified and classified as high. So this classification system is based on the common vulnerability scoring system. What it does is it translates the base score ranges for the different metrics that it uses into a very simple qualitative system of indications, graded critical, high, medium, and low. And in this case, we see we've got 2 high and 4 mediums, which giving an overall vulnerability score according to the tool of high. And we can see on the right here that some of the vulnerable libraries are quite old, being older than 90 days. So that's an indication perhaps that things might be examined in more detail. If we dig into the report in a bit more detail, looking at one of the libraries, we can see it tells us how to deal with some of these vulnerabilities. For each of the libraries, there's a description of the version that's in use, the latest stable version, plus a description of the vulnerability and a recommendation over here of what to do and what steps to take in order to address the vulnerability. In this case, it's suggesting upgrading to a particular version of the library. Of course, this doesn't really tell us how the library is used in the context of the project, and so what the risk is in that context. That requires some further help and expert analysis, and possibly with the help of additional tools. And actually, one of the things we're doing at the moment is we're looking at usage analysis tool from WhiteSource that might actually help us in pinpointing exactly where the vulnerability is being referenced, which could save a lot of time and be very helpful. So moving down the report to this section on the left, you can see this donut chart again, indicating the distributions of licenses amongst the libraries and highlighting if there are any violations over here of our IPR policy. As you can see in this case for WiFiMon, there are none. And then this report gets reviewed by our IPR coordinator, Magdalena, who provides her own recommendation on the libraries and suggestions of what needs to be done. And in this case, we were okay to proceed. There was no action that needed to be taken. But IPR is a very complex area. There are hundreds of open source licenses. So this is an area we're going to pay particular attention to in the future to evolve our policy so we can cover a wider set of licenses, and so the tool can provide more automation in advising what does and doesn't fit the policy. And we don't need to go to a manual inspection process, which is obviously more timely and more complex. So let me summarize what I've talked about. So we've examined a couple of best practice areas, actually. The area of verifying licenses of libraries that are being used in a project, and also the identification of security vulnerabilities. And we looked at the nature of the risk that could occur if due care and attention isn't taken at the outset. We saw how best practice can be supported in these areas through the use of automation tools providing software composition analysis, and what this service based around the WhiteSource tool can offer us. Finally, we looked at how this was applied to a specific project, WiFiMon, and how the results of the analysis contributed to an overall software quality improvement. And I've attached a few comments from the WiFiMon team. They were actually able to use the results to address the issues that would otherwise be quite hard to find, and they were able to address their higher priority issues, and the feedback that we have is that the tool worked very well and the team was satisfied with the information it gave them. So now I'd like to hand back to Bartek to wrap up on what's been presented overall. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you very much. I will share again my screen. Okay, I hope that you can see it. So summarizing, thank you, Maciej, thank you, Alan, for showing us how the best practices could be used in practice and how in detail you can take the most advantage of that. So actually, to summarize, the catalog of our best practices provides directional recommendations for all the objectives that we have identified in the maturity model. The catalog is a live resource, which means we are going to collaborate with you even further to make it more complete and more exhaustive. We are aware, and we want them to be adapted by the teams to fit their specific context, so that the best practices can be adapted to each individual team's needs and circumstances. We, of course, provide the guidance and support in the adaptation process. Best practices, additionally, are supported by various tools and services offered by our Work Package 9 team, Task 2, which means we will help you not just in providing some guidance, but also in providing some additional tools. And of course, the most important issue is that we are seeking collaboration with you on the further development of the best practices catalog. There are at least three reasons for doing that. We want to validate the practices in your projects. We want to refine the best practices based on your feedback and make them even better. And we want to share your best practices and experience with other teams in the form of creating new practices and elaborating new variants of the identified practices. So now I would like you to invite to asking questions and making some remarks. I will display here a number of key references I think you may find useful for the further collaboration. First of all, I would like to turn your attention to the first item, which is the feedback and contact questionnaire, in which you may just indicate that you are interested in the best practices, and we will contact you as soon as possible. Of course, there are other means of contact, and additionally, we provide some various important links that may help you to learn a little bit more about best practices. So now it's time to ask questions, make comments, and I cordially invite you to do so. How can we start the discussion? I think that we showed how the tools could be used in context of the practices, but I'm really curious how you as team leaders, team members are using other tools to support your operations. Maybe we can adopt them in our operations. So the floor is yours, and we are looking to answer your questions and your comments.
I think it'll be interesting to know if any of the tools that have been mentioned are being used by other people and other teams, or there are some sort of tools which perform a similar function but slightly different. And if people see what the tools they use in comparison with the ones that have been presented. And I think me being in the audience today, it's actually interesting to know if that process of identifying best practice, how common it is, or is it something that team need to think how to set up, and what kind of effort it will require from them. That's probably the second question, is more the question to the panel than to the audience. So how do you start, essentially, if somebody wants to collaborate with you and the practice of identifying best practices is not there yet in the defined way, how does one start?
I'm not sure who can specifically answer that. Maybe I will ask, I'm not sure, Szymon, are you there? if not Szymon, then maybe I will ask maybe Maciej about your experiences.
Yep, Bartek, could you tell more? What should I say?
Yes, I wanted to maybe ask you to answer the questions that Irina indicated, namely how a team that would like to implement the best practices and start using our teams, how they can start. So I think you can share your experience in using the tools you also started to apply in your project.
Oh, good question, because when we were identifying best practices we would like to use, there were no catalog of best practices. So basically we started with researching the internet. So it's not easy to start the best practice if you have no expert close to you, because it usually means that you have to find a good book or find a set of good articles. Usually one article is too less. So best practices are best when you apply them correctly. If you do it in a wrong way, then it's only a problem, not a practice, not a good practice. So I don't know how to answer this question, but yep, yeah, it's very helpful if you look for people who already applied that particular practice.
Do you think that the catalog could be a help here? So will it help you to find the necessary directions or indications?
Yeah, I believe that can be useful. However, I'm not sure how to do it properly, but maybe the catalog could somehow reference the teams that already applied particular practices. I don't know.
If I may join Branko here, basically those two examples that have been provided today are two samples of best practices that come from very different directions. While the approach to requirements management and the tools that have been adopted by software catalog team are an bottom-up initiative. It is slightly the opposite when it comes to use of WhiteSource as a driver to basically facilitate the development of the entire IPR management area, and with additional benefit of identifying vulnerabilities in libraries, which was more top-down thing. Perhaps Alan could give a couple of more words regarding the other teams that have been involved, that also performed the scans of their projects. And also our task has a dedicated page regarding WhiteSource, because there are two approaches. One is to set up WhiteSource as something that will be continually used, and another is to just scan the code, get the report, get the recommendations, and continue. On the shared screen, you already have some links that would guide you through that process. Actually, this second from the bottom when it comes to WhiteSource. On the other hand, we don't, whatever your need or ideas are, you don't have to be formal or there is no receipt. Perhaps the easiest way is to get in touch with us, and we could help with what we know, get you in touch with those who know, or at least if you have some ideas and proposals, at least we could help you with common sense questions and as kind of feedback that we could provide that you are already doing.
Yes, I think it's important.
Sorry, I just wanted to pick up on.
Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to pick up on Branko's point about WhiteSource and how it's been used currently. I mean, it's fairly early days, I would say, at the moment for the use of this tool. We've scanned a small number of projects in anger, so to speak, including WiFiMon and EduMeet, and most recently GTS. We did do quite a bit of earlier scanning when we were trying to determine the capabilities of the tool as a kind of test process. But it would be interesting to know from people when they do use the tool, and hopefully they will, is to get some feedback about what they think about it. Is it providing useful information? Are there other ways of using the tool that you could suggest to us in terms of the process we approach? And also, are there other tools that you already use or know of that could be used as complementary to this? Because obviously WhiteSource is only one tool and there are many ways of skinning a cat, as the saying goes. So by using a combination of different software tools and different approaches, we might actually get more information out. So I'd encourage you to take a look at the tool, see what it can offer, and provide feedback when you can. And if possible, and you have identified some other approaches to doing IPR and vulnerability scanning on third-party libraries, please let us know.
Okay, thank you very much. I also think that if a team is interested in adopting certain practices, the first thing we need to know is which practices are of the interest of the team. So we can schedule a meeting, we can just discuss which elements of our catalog are of particular interest of the team, and then to elaborate a common method of implementing this practice. We don't want to mandate you to do anything. It's your, I mean, the team's decision to implement and adopt the practices. And we want to reuse as much as possible of your existing setup. So if you are using your practice, and we would like to just provide you some recommendations of how to change, adapt, or modify certain things, but still the decision is in your hands. So the starting point is in the team's hand, and we will provide the guidance during a number of meetings and the offering of tools. So I think the starting level, starting barrier is quite low, so you're more than invited to try it out.
If I could say a few more words, basically the School of Software Engineering is an annual event, and each year we are trying to, let's say, present some new best practice or set of best practices that are commonly approved, commonly verified. So one of many ways of applying good practices is to be an attendee of a School of Software Engineering.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious of the time. We have just a couple of minutes left. And if there are no further comments from either the audience or the panelists, if I were to summarize, there are no hard and fast rules in distilling or formulating best practice. There are methodologies and approaches, and based on it, but it's all based on practice. And the more evidence is collected from the practice, the more foundation it is to define particular practice as a best practice. And therefore, as Branko mentioned, that can be two directional process. It can be bottom up or it can be top down. But probably the most critical part here is that it's difficult to start if you need to find your way in the sea of methodologies, approaches, and processes and practices. And therefore, it is very important to, as Maciej said, to have somebody to consult, a person, people or the team, people people and teams who already have some experience of doing some research in applying research to practice and defining what best practice means in this particular instance. And this is what the team would like to demonstrate today. And as Bartek said, we are in teams at GÉANT at a really good position because there is a team, there is a task that is offering help and expertise to do it, and hence the invitation for collaboration. Just one more thing to mention, that as I said before, we will circulate the link to the webinar recording and all the links that have been mentioned during the presentations. Also in the chat you have a link to the it's a questionnaire, but it's a very short, virtually 4 questions, and it's more an invitation to collaborate and to get in touch with the team. And to kind of get started or assess your position where you are at. And we will include the link to this questionnaire in the follow-up communication after the webinar. Well, I'm looking at the clock, and I would like to compliment everyone on perfect timing. And also extend a lot of thanks to the audience for their time and support for this initiative, and to the panelists for the an awful lot of time and effort that went into preparing the presentations and arranging them in that logical and structural order and follow the timings. If anyone has got any further questions, there's the time or comments to make them. If not, I would like to wish everyone happy Friday, as it is Friday, and good weekend, and best of luck in anything you do. And thank you very much once again for being with us here today.
Also, thanks to you, Irina.
Thank you. That's very kind. Thank you. Thank you
to the whole team.
Okay. Thanks very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.